You know the biggest age group that's most lonely these days?
Older people?
18 to 30.
Oh, wow.
Way more than
Why?
older people. Way more.
I wonder why.
We live in these siloed societies now, so they don't have that tribe coming around them with love to envelop them. Feeling connected, it's what we think is a lot behind addiction. That lack of connection fosters addiction.
Yeah.
And a really interesting question that I get all the time, and what's interesting about it is the frequency with which I get this question. Let's say I'm disconnected from my partner. How do I reconnect? Let's say I'm not connected to my friends. How do I, okay, so connect. How do I do that?
How to do it, yeah.
That basic question, a lot of people struggle with. Connective is through.
Your TED Talk that you did, I mean, millions of views. You've made some riffles out there, and your books are fantastic. You've spoken at Google. What I'm really curious about is what happens to our brains and our bodies when we go through heartbreak or trauma of any kind of sort. Because a lot of people that I am speaking to right now have, I think, a lot of potential emotional trauma, and it seems to come out in food habits sometimes. So what does that actually look like physiologically?
So let's talk about, you said heartbreak and trauma, and let's talk about emotional pain in general. The interesting thing about what we see in our brain when we do functional MRI brain scans, and those are brain scans in which somebody's lying in that tube, which is the MRI, and they're asked to do something. And so you can see what's happening in the brain in real time when they're doing it. And so one study compared what happens if we put people in a functional MRI tube. And in one section of the study, we'll put a heat inducer on their forearm, showing my forearm in the, and we'll keep raising it until they can't stand it anymore, see what happens in the brain. And then we'll bring in heartbroken people, have them stick a picture of the person who broke their heart to the top of the tube, which makes it roughly here, so it's a narrow tube, and have them relive the breakup. Now let's do both those things and compare those images from the functional MRI and see what happens in the brain. And the brain looks very, very similar. It's not exact, but it's very, very similar. When we experience emotional or social pain versus when we experience physical pain, it's very, very similar what happens in the brain. And that's why we experience emotional pain from heartbreak, from rejection, from loss, as excruciating and very, very strong. It impacts us like we're in physical pain. Except in that study with the physical pain, it was a 7-second tolerance. Like, can you tolerate this for 7 seconds? Heartbreak goes on for longer than 7 seconds. And the pain's comparable at very high levels. And so we need to know that when we're experiencing emotional pain and people are saying, oh, just pick yourself up through your through your bootstraps and just like go on and just... No, you wouldn't say that to somebody who's in significant, serious physical pain. You wouldn't say to them, oh, just snap out of it. But we say that to people who are heartbroken or experiencing emotional pain, even though it's truly equivalent.
So when you're measuring it, are you measuring heart rate or
what they're literally looking at is what is getting activated in the brain. What are the pathways that are getting activated, and are there similar pathways? And usually different things activate different pathways. You're not going to see the same areas of the brain light up. But you do in this study. It's very, very similar. Somebody actually came in, apparently anecdotally, to the room when they were doing that, and they couldn't tell which brain image they were looking at, whether that was a physical pain or an emotional pain brain image.
Oh, that's so fascinating. It makes a lot of sense.
Right.
Really does. Like, I've personally been through experiences, I would say the hardest ones were a form of heartbreak in a sense. And it's funny too, because I think friends can also break people's hearts. It's not always a romantic thing, right? It's kind of all around.
Well, heartbreak, the romantic part of it is it's a form of grief. It's a form of loss. And any loss can activate grief. When you have a very, very good friend, like a best friend, and something goes wrong there and you lose that person, not to disease or something, but literally just the friendship ruptures, that is a huge loss for people, depending on the context, right? This is all context specific and person specific with generalities, but that person could have been the pivotal person in your life. There are many people who say to me, I don't talk to my partner about the stuff that hurts me or that I'm worried about or that I feel about, I talk to my best friend about that. And so that best friend can have such a huge function that to lose that person can truly evoke heartbreak.
Yeah, it's crazy. I am so fascinated by this because I remember in one go, I ended up breaking up with my boyfriend who I had been with for about 3 years. And we worked together too. So that was terrible. But at the same time, someone in my family, my mom, she ended up really just emotionally struggling at the time and physically. And so I kind of in a way lost her. And then simultaneously, a couple of my friendships that were really core for different reasons just fell through. And I remember being so distraught. There were certain things that would trigger me and I couldn't not cry. It just wasn't possible. And it's almost, you've talked about this, where it's kind of like you go crazy and you don't get it. What's up with that? How does that come out in people?
So the other thing that happens in our brain, and this is specifically about romantic heartbreak, but the other thing that happens in our brain, so the pain looks similar in those pathways. But the other thing that looks similar is when you look at what's happening to somebody when they are heartbroken romantically, and freshly so, probably, you see the same pathways activate in the brain as get activated when you see opioid addicts, heroin addicts, withdrawing from heroin. Because when we're in love, and people who've had the experience, especially at the beginning, of being infatuated with someone, we get addicted to them. And this can happen after a date, right? That you will start checking, have they texted me yet? Have they texted me yet? It's like an addict. You're constantly looking for a fix, looking for a fix, looking for a fix, looking for a fix. So love is very addictive. The brain people say, well, love is all consuming. So is heroin, turns out. And so, and that's why they're very similar in that way. And then if you withdraw that all-consuming thing, turns out people go nuts. Now, if you see a heroin addict doing all kinds of desperate things, stealing when they're an honest person, begging when they're a proud person, prostituting themselves when they're a private or whatever conservative person, you would understand, well, it's heroin. Of course they're doing that.
Right.
Well, the brain thinks that, romantic heartbreak is the same kind of thing. And you will see, and I see this all the time in my practice, people doing desperate things that are hugely out of character. And because it's so out of character, they're like, what's happening to me? I feel like I'm going crazy. I'm not in control. I'm doing these things that I would never do. And I feel humiliated just thinking about them, and I can't stop. What is going on with me? Because they don't understand how strongly the brain is giving them the signal of, get that person back, get that person back. It's the only thing that matters.
Right, like survival. You need
survival, completely.
Yeah. What is that? You almost wonder, is it love or is it addiction/attachment?
So there was a debate I read somewhere in some of the scientific journals that was debating, and again, this is a debate between scientists. They're saying, like, love registers in the brain so powerfully, it should be classified as an addiction, or in other words, it's kind of like an addiction. Now, that's not the romantic way to think about love in any way, shape, or form, that it's an addiction, but it functions in a very similar way. And there's, an evolutionary use to that because of pair bonding, and if the partners are infatuated, then they will together more likely do a better job of raising the child to be able to survive and pass along their genes, etc. So there's an evolutionary imperative which made that very useful for us, but it left us with this legacy of it being the most incredibly powerful thing, and we're not in tribes anymore meeting one person. We're swiping left and right all the time, and so we can fall for the wrong person or with very, very little information, which is what often happens. Like, we just get a couple of data points and we already are marrying this person in our head and picking out the china patterns, and it's like we don't know them at all yet.
We don't know them at all. Yeah, there's so many times I feel like often people have jumped into relationships because of that sense of attachment and belonging. I mean, that's not news. We've all probably to a certain degree done something like that. I know I have. And it's funny to think about how that separation is such an ingrained thing in all of us. Like you said, it's a tribal instinct to belong. And I feel, especially today in modern day society, with our lack of community in a lot of ways, and with our lack of contact points with people, a lot, I live alone, it's kind of weird to do if you really think about how humans evolved. I feel that
Correct.
with that lack of contact points and the lack of community in a lot of cities, people latch on to their person that they think they're in love with or they are in love with, either way. And if and when that break occurs, it's so traumatizing in such a deep way.
Yes, and here's another reason why. It's not just that they latch on, or we latch on, we all do the same thing. It's that we want that person to be a lot of things for us. Tribes, we assume what that is, were roughly around 150 people. That's kind of the magic number of 100, 150 people, maybe 50 people.
Okay.
But they were small in other ways. And so you had the friend you could go to for this, and the wise man who could give you the counsel, and the wise woman who could give you the counsel, and the shaman who could cure this and the this. Everyone had a specific function in the tribe. We didn't need one person to be everything for us. Our soulmate, our romance, our entertainment, our sex partner, our confidant, we expect so much. And so when we're losing, we're not just losing, oh, this is the person I sleep with, or this is my companion. We're losing the best friend, and the person I sleep
Right.
with, and the person I do entertainment with, and the person that introduces me to new things, and the person. It's a huge, huge loss. And that's why it feels so powerful today, because we put so much on that person.
I was just talking about that with my best friend. We were talking, we're like, is it possible for one person to fill all those roles the way that we think and the way that we've kind of been, I don't know, conditioned to think about it? Do you think so? Like, do you think it's possible for one person to fill, hey, they're funny and they're attractive and they're smart and they're your companion and they like to talk to you about the hobbies you like? Is that, from all the people you've spoken to, realistic, and all the research and the work you've done, or not really?
I think the question is really, is a relationship like that realistic? Because either it goes both ways, or one is giving and the other one's taking more, right? So you want some kind of mutuality. Does that happen sometimes? Yes. Are there some lucky people who have found the person that they really feel very contained with, and this person is actually enough for me, and we're together, and that's great, and that can go on for a long time? Yes, that can happen. Is it the norm? No, not remotely. And if it's what we're looking for, we're going to pass up a lot of really good people who check 8 out of the 10 boxes, and we don't need them to check all 10. Some of the boxes might be critical for us, right? Like, attraction or feeling bonded, but we don't need all of the 10 boxes. Perhaps you need to go and get a friend that you can go and see the games with, and it doesn't have to be your girlfriend. You know what I mean? In other words, farm out a little bit. Use other people to, and it's not just to satisfy your needs, but to address different aspects of our identity and our personality.
Right.
Because
Our-
we can
our
be,
characteristics.
we are varied people. We have a lot of aspects to us, but one person's only going to bring out a specific number of those, and that's why we need other people, because with that person, they think I'm really funny. My partner might not.
Right. Yeah, I find that to be so important. In my last relationship, my partner at the time was everything. My entire social unit was kind of tied up in that person. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that if you have a healthy attachment to somebody. Over time, you do share friendships, you do share family and all that stuff. But I came to find the value in cultivating my own sense of community, to your point, with other people who bring out different kind of like personality traits that I have. And I've started to think that the way that our society does this relationship thing now, because we're so siloed and isolated, is not really the way to go about it. Because if the break happens, or even if a break happens elsewhere and we are still with our partner, we are expecting that partner to then carry everything for us in terms of all of our sadness. And that doesn't seem
Right.
fair either.
Right. It's just a lot of burden to put on one relationship.
Yeah.
is the issue there. And again, we are complex people. We want to be able to express that complexity. And it's also true that we make a lot of compromises in any relationship that we're in, because it's never going to be 100% overlap. So maybe this kind of thing that I enjoy, I won't do as much because they don't enjoy it. And this friend kind of pisses them off, so you kind of get distant from that friend, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, I used to love eating that, but no, they're vegetarians, so I can't bring that home. And over time, we make a lot of compromises, which is fine. That's absolutely necessary for a relationship. But some of those compromises are in aspects of ourselves that are not getting expressed. And that's too big a compromise, because we don't have to express them all in our relationship. We do need to be more interdependent so that we can have our individual lives and then come together in the overlap. But the other problem today is our virtual world, right? That you know, we are behind our screens or in front of our screens with our phones, and that is a substitute for a lot of us for time we would have spent in the real world with people. If before, you know, phones, before dating apps, you had to go somewhere to meet someone.
Right.
You actually had to leave the house. And now we don't.
Yeah.
And so we're spending much less face-to-face time and much more screen time. So the substitute is a net loss in a significant way.
Oh, it's significant. I was just talking about this last night with a few friends. We were all getting together. There's this group of people that we get together on Wednesday nights, and we just have a topic. And the topic last night happened to be loneliness versus solitude. Last week it was fate. And it's all these people from different creeds and different backgrounds. We just talk. That's it. We're just there to talk and hear and listen and debate, maybe, if we feel like it. But to do that in person has such a different, I hate to use the word vibe, but kind of vibe to it, you know,
Feel,
where
vibe,
you can actually feel. Yeah. And you can feel one another. And that's sort of what I've been seeing going on a lot with people in general. And this is just a reflection of my own life experience. But cancel culture has been such a wild thing going on, because it perpetuates this fear of speaking your mind, and it perpetuates this fear of separating from the tribe, or even speaking out against something your partner doesn't want, whatever, right? And I'm curious if that's made your work more complex, where you're trying to help people understand, you know, how to have emotional first aid and how to heal from these things. But have you seen that impact from cancel culture?
Yes. Let me talk about it in this way. And just to mention, I have a monthly newsletter that I send out to my subscribers. And it's called the Get Wrong, Do Right Emotional Health Newsletter, because every month I look at something in this area that we get very wrong. And I talk about why we get it wrong, what's wrong about our assumptions, and how we do it right. And this month, in May, the topic was resilience, emotional resilience.
Okay.
And this is related to emotional resilience, because resilience happens by overcoming hardship. It's calluses, emotional calluses is how you have to think about it. You get calluses from injuries, from overuse, right? When guitar players have calluses on their fingers because they're constantly strumming. So when you go through hardship, that's when you potentially can develop resilience. When you're in discomfort, you can expand your comfort zone. And so the problem, though, is that we might go through hardship. In the newsletter, I give the example of the pandemic. It was hard on all people in different ways at different times, but no one was, like sailing through. And not everyone's going to build resilience from that. Because to build resilience, you have to have a story about how I survived this, what got me through it. If you don't, and you just say, like, I'll never be able to do that again, you haven't built resilience. But the same is true of comfort zones. Comfort zones, unless you're constantly trying to expand them, shrink. You see that in anxiety. When somebody's, let's say, anxious socially, they will not socialize as much. And then the idea of even interacting with a neighbor might become very, very scary. When you haven't done something for a while, it's more intimidating. So the problem with cancel culture is, if you are not exposed to any uncomfortable views, to any views that are different than yours, that put you in discomfort because it's anger, because it's frustration, because it's bewilderment, then you are actually shrinking your resilience. You are making yourself more sensitive, less likely to be able to cope, more likely to be triggered or traumatized by things that shouldn't really trigger or traumatize you if you had more regular exposure to them.
Right.
And so that's the problem with cancel culture, that it really is not doing us any favors in terms of our general emotional resilience. It's compromising it.
Yeah, I've heard you talk about this before. It's almost like when you're lonely or when you're isolated or when you're heartbroken or insecure or whatever, you sort of get stuck in this, you're in your head and you're reinforced by the immediate environment, which may be the ones rejecting you, let's say. But then you're in your head and then you start to think that everyone's rejecting you and you stop putting yourself out there more because you're fearing the more rejection. I know that was so true for me. I remember being at my last, where I was in that place I was talking about, I felt so insecure about myself for so many things that actually I have come to find are not real. It was just my perception of them. And I imagine that's a lot of what you see in your work too, is people's perception of reality that isn't quite reality.
Right. Now, I'm sure a ton of your viewers have had the experience of swiping, being on a dating app, say, getting rejected at some point, and it could even be before they met the person or even after a first date, and having this reaction, I'm getting off the app.
Yeah.
I'm taking a break. And why? Because it hurt and you don't want to hurt again. Mm-hmm. But you looking for love or for companionship, you're not going to find it if you're not going to look. So why would you stop looking for the thing? Because it's scary, because it's uncomfortable. And that's our response. Well, if it's uncomfortable, let's not do it. Or let's soothe it. And, the thing most people use to soothe is not alcohol and it's not drugs. It's food. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, I actually am curious if you know anything about the carnivore or the animal-based lifestyle. Have you heard of that before?
A little bit, but in what context?
Just curious about if you know about it. I talk a lot about that on here. The reason I talk about it is not because I'm particularly interested in like a diet fad. It really, for me, changed my entire perception of reality. I went through so much of my life feeling just debilitating anxiety and just I was on antidepressants for 10 years. And it truly affected the decisions I made in my life, who I picked as a partner, why I picked them in a lot of different ways, my relationship style, attachment styles, all that, right? And I have found just how important food affects us. And it seems like what you're finding with all of your clients is that they use food to suppress bad feelings, which is not surprising, right? But I'm imagining it's probably highly processed foods, things sugary to give them an endorphin or, a boost to feel good. And then it just kind of comes full circle and it takes them down further.
Yeah, but the scary thing is that so many people have no awareness that they're doing that.
Right.
Have no awareness that that's the function of the food that they're eating. For example, there's studies that show, a lot of studies have happened lately about how we think about our jobs or our work when we're outside of work. And do you kind of dwell or brood or ruminate about things that worried you at work? How many of us kind of go home and we're thinking about something that happened at work and we're checked out during dinner and we watching a movie but missed the first hour because we were in our head having a fantasy argument with a colleague, that kind of thing. The research is, just as an example, the more you ruminate about work outside of work, not when you're at work, when no one's paying you to do it, outside of work, the more likely you are to eat unhealthy foods. What's the content? Why is one related to the other? Again, because we're troubled. And when we're troubled, we eat more mindlessly. We make mindless decisions. We're not even actually going and deciding we're going to snack. It was there, so we're just going bowl to mouth, and we'll wake up when we're done. Suddenly the bowl's empty. I didn't know where, hadn't decided to do that, So when we're preoccupied, when we're troubled, when we're upset, certainly when we're ruminating, we are much less mindful about what we eat, and we're letting, autopilot take over, and autopilot will be like, I'm not feeling great, so let's soothe.
Yeah, your TED Talk that you did where you were talking a lot about topics around this. I mean, millions of views. You've made some riffles out there, and your books are fantastic. You've spoken at Google. I mean, what solutions have you found, that have helped people, particularly in that arena, the self-soothing? People get addicted to whatever the solution is, whether it is alcohol or it's food or it's immediately finding a, what do they call it? The rebound partner or some other addiction, addiction to love or food or alcohol or another substance. What are you seeing that's been so effective for people to help them out?
Well, that's a very general, that's a lot there. So, the treatments for these things are treatment specific. So it depends on really specific situations. So you mentioned the rebound relationship, right? Mm-hmm. I'm fine with the rebound relationship as long as in your head you're clearly aware that it's a rebound relationship.
Okay.
I'm not fine with a rebound relationship if you say to yourself, I'm so lucky I met the next love of my life 5 minutes after the last one. Who would thought? And that's a problem because they're not likely to be. So you're deluding yourself. And it's also kind of means that you when they're looking just to substitute the feelings from one to the other. Because the other reality is when we break up with someone, a lot of what we miss is not the person, but the idea of the person. The fact that we had a partner, the companionship. We could indeed substitute them because there were so many compromises. And I've had people who broke up with somebody 10 times, got back together with them. And the 11th, when it was the other person breaking up with them, they're like, oh my God, this was the most perfect person. It's the love of my life. And I'm like, really? You broke up with them 10 times?
Right.
You've been complaining about them every week for 3 years. Love of your life, it wasn't. But in their head, they're like, oh, they were amazing. And I'm like, no, you're completely deluded. But that's the thing. We have these... we get, our perceptions get distorted because of emotional pain, because of all kinds of agendas, because of need. And so the general thing, to answer your question about what people need to become much more informed about this apparatus, because it doesn't serve us a lot of the time. Our mind will often get us to do the absolute wrong thing. It's our mind that's saying, oh, look, there's a bowl of something on the table, whether you want to or not, just start shoveling it into your mouth because you're not feeling great about things right now.
Yep.
That's our mind. Our mind will say to us, you know what's a great idea? You should send the ex that just broke up with you, say like 150 to 160 texts in 1 hour, because that will be smart. That's our mind. We can't let it determine these things, but to not do that, we have to become much more informed.
Yeah, it's almost like you have to decide what reality is when you have a moment of peace and then choose to stick with that when you know your brain is going to mess with you. For example, right now, this is just an example of like a real life thing, but I love when it's like 9:30, 10 at night and just to have like another dinner for no reason. I don't even know why. I'm just like watching a movie. It's terrible for you to do that though. So every single night I've decided to stop eating, and I'm eating healthy, good food and all that, but around like 8, just to have dinner and be done. But when 9:30 comes around, for some reason it's like, okay, have a snack. And I'm not even hungry. It's just a program that's running. And so I think it's like we have to reprogram ourselves basically.
Right, but let me tell you my suggestion there. And this is something that happens to a lot of people. And they will tell me exactly that. I'm not hungry. I don't really have a reason. I just find myself having another meal or a snack or that. And I will say to them, okay, the next time that happens, which will be tonight at 9:30, pause the TV, turn off the screen, sit in a comfortable place, close your eyes, and reflect on what you're feeling. You are feeling something distressing of sorts at 9:30, 10. Because of the hour, it could be, this is when I would like to be going to bed with someone and I'm not. Or this is when I'm not busy with work, so I'm not distracted, so I have a minute to think about the fact that I am lonely. Or this is when my mind is free and I start to worry about things I have to do the next day. There is something going on. You are not doing that for no reason. And we don't have that mentality to, when we're confused about our behavior, stop, pause, reflect on how you feel. Now, here's something I recommend to all people, and people always look at me like that's insulting, and I'm like, I use it, it's not insulting. And that is, there's something called the wheel of emotion, the emotion wheel. You can find them online. There are 100 versions of them. And all it is, it's like a color wheel, but it lists 100 to 200 feelings. And why it's very useful is because when I ask people, what do you feel? They'll say one thing or two. And it's usually primary colors: sad, happy. When you look at what's happening with you at 9:30 at night, you'll see a word like lonely or preoccupied or worried or needy, and the word will make you feel like, yes, a little bit of this, yes, a little bit of that. You don't have to, on a scale of 1 to 10, they don't have to be tens. You can feel this at an 8 and this at a 2 and this at a 3, but our feelings are not strands. They're tapestries. They're complex. So if you use the emotion wheel for 7 nights in a row, whenever that hour comes around and you're feeling that, and you really pause before you go for the whatever it is you eat, and you literally reflect and try and figure out, where are you feeling things in your body? How are you feeling it? Use the emotion wheel. Make a list of all the different... You will find a pattern that, wow, every night I tend to feel a little bit of this and a little bit of this, and these kind of add up to a pattern. And then you can actually do something to address those feelings. Maybe the thing you do at 9:30 at night is call a friend who's maybe on the, a different coast, and so you can, the hours are okay, but maybe you just need to reach out and connect at that time, and maybe that takes away the need to eat. Or maybe you just need to give a talking to yourself and say, you know what, it's okay that I'm feeling lonely. I'm looking for a relationship. I haven't found one yet. I'm just making this up. I don't know what you're feeling, but I'm just saying as an example, I haven't found one yet, but it's okay. I can self-soothe. I can be self-compassionate and be like, it's okay that you feel this. These are the difficult hours for you. That's okay. You find different ways of coping that you are in control of and that you are doing intentionally rather than by autopilot, which is not you deciding to do it.
Right. You're essentially identifying the patterns based off of your emotional cues that are going to give you the mix to the concoction of what's going on, so that you can reverse it or change it or adjust.
Lauren, one of the things I always say is that people have this line that the human brain might be the most brilliant machine in the universe, and it might be, but it requires adult supervision. And we have to be our own supervisor. In other words, that's disengage the autopilot. It doesn't work when you're in any kind of emotional distress, because our mind evolved to protect us from that feeling, when that feeling can be necessary, useful, unavoidable. So just to try soothe it with food or distract from it is not useful. So we really have to disengage, examine how we're feeling, and then make a decision about, how do I want to address this feeling? I might not. I might just need to learn to tolerate it. But it's a decision.
It is a decision. It seems like it comes in line with discipline to a certain degree. You have to be disciplined to want to figure out the problem. You have to. And you have to know when your brain is telling you something that's you versus the layer on top of you that's not quite, adapted to your new reality. You're not quite getting enough attention, maybe. With breakups and all of these forms of rejection, I remember you talking about something to do with cold, something about the coldness on people's skins with rejection. What was that study?
It was with loneliness, that people, and that's a study that, the way studies work, just the way the science works, is you do a study to look at something, and then you look to that study to be replicated or reinforced by other studies. And so studies sometimes can come out and they'll be like, oh, that's so interesting. But then the following studies don't quite show that. So I think this was one of those that I wrote about at some point, because the initial studies were coming out and I'm not sure that it completely got verified, so I want to qualify it. But at the time, the study was that, there's language like being left out in the cold, right? Or being, like when we're turned away, when we're ostracized, we're being left out in the cold. And this whole idea of cold and loneliness has a lot of overlap. And so in one of those studies, they saw that people who were lonely tended to estimate their body temperature as being lower, tended to prefer hot baths. Again, not fully replicated as far as I recall, but there's a lot of ways in which we embody in our body certain mental states. So, for example, one study that has been one kind of study that has been reinforced is that when people are negotiating, if you put somebody on a hard chair, they'll negotiate harder than if they're sitting in a soft chair.
I
that
totally
kind of
get
rubbish,
that.
like, but it's, yeah, but it's funny. I mean, it's funny because it happens, but this is the level of unconscious stuff that goes on that we're not aware of, but we should become aware of because it can be very instrumental.
Oh yeah. So to that point, the things that we're unaware of, the energetic, I would say, relationship we have to things is so much bigger than I thought, and that's so much of what I have learned in the last 2 years of how important that is. And even just grounding outside, going outside and sitting by a tree it sounds so stupid if you don't know what it is, but it is life changing, and it really is like this energetic thing where you can start to, for me at least, feel love a little bit more or something within myself and to nature and this and that. And it's not something that we do in society very much, is understand the small ways that we do or don't connect with things and with other people. And it can have a profound effect on our sense of reality and really where we belong in this world. And it sounds so silly, but everything is so much more energetic than we think it is. All these little things do.
Well, nature is very powerful, and there's so many studies. Like, here's a simple one. They took people who were anxious and troubled about something, and they had two groups. In one group, they had to take an hour and walk around the block, and another group had an hour to walk around the park. And then they measured who feels less anxious, who feels more sanguine, who's less preoccupied. The park. Nature has a ton of usefulness. Now, I'm saying this as a person who lives in Manhattan in New York City, where nature, not so abundant, as it were, to get to a park. It's central, like, it's not that simple. But I feel I get like withdrawal from nature. Like, I literally, the days if I've been too much I'll be like, I need to go and just sit under a tree or I will take a detour of numerous blocks on the way home to go past a park that have flowers so I can slowly walk and smell the flowers, because I need that. Nature is a restorative thing. So nature is super powerful.
Yeah, it's almost like when you've never done that, you don't know what you're missing out on. And I feel like people talking about emotional first aid and helping themselves through situations, but also just maintaining mental health, that is such a profound tool that we don't get it. We don't realize because we're in such a modernized society. And it really wasn't until I quit my job. I was at this time, I quit my job, the job that I was at with my ex at the time who was working there. So that was beneficial, but I was still really coming off of this, just deep insecurity, deep feelings of rejection from a lot of different scenarios. And I spent a year not working. First time in my life I'd ever done that. Thankfully, I'd saved enough money to be able to do that. And, spent a lot of time outside because I was the first time not in a building. And I can't express how big of a deal that became for me. Like, everything got better. Anxiety, feelings of loneliness or rejection, it matters. It just does.
If you live in an apartment building, go to the roof, look out at wherever you are. It will make you see things differently. There's this phenomenon that all astronauts were reporting in the 60s and 70s, that when they would get to space, they felt this kind of unity, this kind of, we are all one. They all became humanists. The Russian astronauts, the Soviet astronauts, the American astronauts. Why? Because they were seeing the Earth from such a vantage point. It looked like, oh, it's just this small thing from up here. You can't see people, you can't see borders, you can't see countries. It was and so any kind of perspective, for example, if you're going on holiday, if you're going on vacation, and you're away from where you live, that's a great time to reflect, because you are not in the context of your daily life, so you will see things much more clearly when you're away from your daily life. It's difficult to see it from within. You need to step outside, literally, as you did, and sometimes far outside, to be able to get a real perspective and kind of center yourself in terms of what's real versus what's a little bit illusory.
Yeah, the overview effect. I'm actually going to have a couple.
Effect.
Oh yeah, I'm going to have a couple of those astronauts on to talk about it.
I love the overview effect because it was such a byproduct of the space race that no one expected, And people didn't like it at the time because the governments were like, no, you should be nationalist. What's this kumbaya
Yeah.
thing going on?
Yeah, what is this thing of togetherness? We can't have that. It's terrible.
Yeah.
What is your you deal with people that sorry, I shouldn't say you deal with people, but you work with people that are experiencing heartbreak romantically. And is it common for you to experience heartbreak through loss or pets or best friends as well?
So there's a phenomenon called broken heart syndrome, which is a physiological phenomenon in which it mimics a coronary event. In other words, your excuse me, your hormones, your markers of a coronary event are really significantly elevated. You think you're having a heart attack, and unlike an anxiety attack, in which you think you're having a heart attack, but it's just anxiety, here, if you go to the ER, there'll be certain markers which actually look elevated. And so there's something that's changing in your heart in that, and it's entirely psychological. So they call it the broken heart syndrome. One of the reports of that, which I spoke about in my book, How to Fix a Broken Heart, was a woman, and she experienced that because her dog died, and she was so heartbroken that her heart literally was starting to change shape, and all these things were happening. And so it can happen from any kind of loss, grief, trauma. There can be a big physiological response.
That story really stuck with me because, and not to get too, personal with it, but it is relevant. My mom passed away like 7 months ago, and there was a lot of health issues going on, but it was wild the way it went down and showed me a lot about how heartbreak works. Again, part of why I wanted to talk with you. She had a dog that it was like her baby, and she lived alone. And anyways, they went for a walk. Dog got hit by a car.
Oh.
My mom died the next day, basically, if not within the next 14 hours, right? And there were health issues and all that, but for that to be that correlated is clearly heartbreak. That's what that was.
Yeah, and you see that with older couples as well. When one of them dies, the other one, much older couples, mind you, the other one often dies very, very soon. Loneliness, for example, suppresses the function of our immune system. So if you're bereft and you are grieving and you are lonely, all your immune system is not functioning, and so then you're much more susceptible to everything, as it were. But I just wanted to say one thing. I'm an animal lover, admittedly, and my big weakness is dogs, admittedly, and dogs are unique, in the animal kingdom, in that they are the most loyal, loving, most of them, creatures. And to come home to something that is always thrilled to see you, that just thinks that you are the sun and the moon and all of it, is a very powerful thing. And then to lose an animal like that is an incredibly powerful thing as well, and it can really send people into grief spirals. Especially, again, I live in New York City. There are a lot of people who live here who are not partnered, and they have a dog. The dog is the partner, and when the dog dies, it goes from feeling loved and feeling belonging, and you have somebody to care for, and you have somebody who cares for you, to nothing, and it can be devastating. So yeah, pet loss is a hugely devastating thing for most people, and underappreciated by others.
It is. I have to say that though I understood, I didn't quite understand until after that happened, obviously, and that really, all of this seems like so much of why heartbreak occurs, the physiological effects, the emotional, all that is due to a massive loss of connection, in a sense. There was some connection we were getting. Maybe it's a sense of belonging. It's a sense of love that's non-conditional, maybe, or we thought. Maybe it's a sense of tribal, something biologically in us that is triggered so heavily when we go through some loss, to the point that we have to fill. It's almost like we have this cup that was full, and then we go through this breakup and it's like down, and then we fill it up with food or alcohol or whatever, another person that may help to find that connection. But it seems that the way to go is to design our lives in such a way to have connection in other places too. Or when maybe if we didn't have that in that moment of a breakup or a loss, understand that and realize that, because we're losing this connection, this sense of sort of self is almost gone too. And where can we go to find and reestablish connection?
Right.
And
So
how do we
if
do that?
I'm sorry to interrupt there, but as you know, in almost every major religion, rituals around grief and loss include the community. The community comes together for the Shiva, for the wake, for the memorial service, for whatever it is. Because, as you said, those are the times when we feel a big loss of connection to a person or to an animal. We need that reinforced. We need the social support. Social support is a huge factor in people's ability to recover from heartbreak and from all kinds of emotional events, and certainly from all kinds of loss. But we live in these siloed societies now, in these, like people are working from home. They might not even see somebody for a few days, and people are remote, and people move, and so they're far away, so they don't have that tribe coming around them with love to envelop them. And we need that when we're going through any kind of hardship, really. And without that, everything is more difficult. So this idea of connection, it's called a social cure, because feeling connected it's what we think is a lot behind addiction. That lack of connection fosters addiction. And so connection, it's like one of the most important things that people can focus on. And just to be clear about something, I also have my second newsletter was about loneliness, and I explained that the definition is not a quantity of people around you. It is quality entirely. It's whether you feel subjectively that people around you see you, appreciate you, care for you. Not reality, subjectively. And that's what defines it. And so people can seem to have lots of people around them but feel so alienated. A huge percentage of lonely people are coupled, but they sit on the couch with their partner. They don't really talk. No transactional, just all transactional conversations. Did you buy milk? Did you pay this? Did you do? They're not connected, and they can feel exquisitely lonely being side by side with somebody all the time. So we really have to be clear about the definition. It's not who's around us. It's who we feel sees us that makes the difference.
Totally couldn't agree more. I mean, you're obviously the expert in that, but I felt what you're saying. I know what you're talking about. I used to have this thing in my head, and there's a lot of people that I'm 30, my age and younger, I think, that we have been conditioned to think about friends in terms of numbers. Just numbers. I have 7 bridesmaids or 10, and if you don't have more than 6, you're going to look like a loser. No one says that, but it's kind of a little bit of a thought, I think. And the more I go deeper with people versus wider, the better I feel, the more connected I feel. And that is a skill that I think people have to relearn. I'm only saying that because I had to relearn it. My background is in sales. And a lot of people's backgrounds are in sales. And what do you do in sales? You get very good at connecting with people and hearing and listening, but it only goes so far. And you're doing it all the time, all day. And so it's kind of like this transactional false connection. And I think a lot of people live their lives like that. They don't actually talk about anything, even with their partners. It's like this whole
correct thing. And one really interesting question that I get all the time, and what's interesting about it is the frequency with which I get this question, and the number of people who really, when like in a Q&A, when I give talks to companies, and in a Q&A, somebody will ask this question, which I'm about to say, and you'll see everybody in the audience going like, oh yeah, and leaning in, even though the question will sound stupid. Here's the question. So let's say I'm disconnected from my partner. How do I reconnect? Let's say I'm not connected to my friends. So connect. How do I do that?
How to do it, yeah.
That basic question, a lot of people struggle with. Because they'll go in and they'll get together and they'll do small talk, chit-chat. Mm-hmm. It's not connective. Connective is through vulnerability, through shared experiences, through talking about your feelings. That's what's connective. You can talk about the game, you can talk about work, you can talk about whatever you want, but if it's not emotional, if it's not vulnerable, it's not connective. And, I'll say to people, like, you can sometimes bump into someone you haven't seen for a while and have a 15-minute conversation in which you're literally, like, during the pandemic, it was good because people were like, how are you doing? And people were really asking how you're doing in the early days of the pandemic. And people said, like, oh, it's been really hard. I live alone, so it's so difficult. But people were, like, being vulnerable and sharing that because it was so universal. And people were just meeting somebody 15 minutes, 6 feet apart, and walking away from those conversations. And I think everyone will recognize this, that you sometimes walk away from a conversation like that, you went deep for just a few minutes, and you walk away feeling like, oh, I really like that person. I really miss that. You feel connection is something, you feel it. But you have to, it's in. So if you're not going to go deeper, you won't be able to connect.
Yeah.
Men, for example, don't do it as verbally as women do it, but they do have to acknowledge it. For example, here's an example of two men. They might go and do something together like fly fishing, stand 5 hours, shoulder to shoulder, not say a word, but at the end of it, look at each other and go, it was really good to see you. And that really personal exchange makes the whole 5 hours very connective, because that was a vulnerable thing to say, and that was a response that they got. So again, connect. There's no simple way, there's no superficial way, there's no quick way. You got to actually pay the price of having the trust, being vulnerable, showing your feelings, asking about the other person. And if you don't know if it was connective, it wasn't. Because when it is, you know it.
It's there. Yeah, I remember feeling very disconnected. And then I didn't want to tell anybody what I was dealing with. I was ashamed of it. And I think if anybody's feeling that way, we got to, like, snap out of it, because other people have experienced loss or breakups too. And I think it seems, at least for me, it was starting to talk to my friends about how I felt, and then beginning to do that versus just my partner who who I'd lost, or, at the time, my mom, who I was used to doing that. Those were the two people I was really very used to confiding in. And without them, I was like, God, I don't even know who to talk to, because I wasn't, I got in that habit of just talking to my two people over many years. So I had to relearn, is what I'm saying, how to be vulnerable, how to ask them deep questions, and then, but first maybe share my own, so that there is a lead of me being vulnerable to make it okay for them to be kind of vulnerable. And that has transformed my entire life, because everything has improved. Everybody's more vulnerable and just real. But I think you're completely right with men. Like, men have this ability, I've noticed, to do things together, and where I think a lot of women sometimes can lack that. A lot of times women, in my experience at least, will get together and talk, whereas men will do things together and not talk about things as much. And it'd be kind of nice if both could get a little bit of the other.
I agree. I think there's a happy medium. But I do want to say something about your experience and what you said there, because this is what I mean by you can't fudge it. You can't do it simple. When you were trying to relearn this, which I think everyone needs to do, you took emotional risks. Because when you're opening up to someone and you're not used to it, you don't know if their response... Like, somebody once told me that they had a great friend, and they went through something, and they just went to that friend and they said, can I talk to you? And the friend said, sure. And they, for 30 minutes, spilled their guts. And the friend looked so compassionate and so sympathetic. But what the friend said at the end of that was this: bummer. Period. And the other person felt like, that's it.
Mortified, probably.
Bummer. No, they weren't mortified, because they could see the person cared, but the friend wasn't able to articulate that in any complex way beyond bummer. And so it didn't feel connective, because they didn't have the words. And that's the point about, women are socialized to be much better than men in being able to articulate emotions and all of that. I wish men were better at it, because, again, you took an emotional risk once and again, and you did it serially throughout a period, and you continue to do it. You take emotional risks. Scary, yes. Can it go wrong sometimes? Yes. There's no shortcuts, though. It's the only way to connect. And the second thing is that I am pretty sure, without knowing at all, that when you were sharing with these friends how you were feeling, none of them were like shocked that you might be lonely after the breakup.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty. I think you're right. It's like a lot of times the way that we like somebody may just not have the words to understand. Like men, a lot of times don't. I'll talk to my cousin sometimes, and I know he empathizes with me, but he'll be like, "Damn." That's it.
Yes, and you can see him feeling it, but like,
Yeah.
oh, use your words, for goodness sakes,
Just
like
come
like
on.
just say a little something. And
Vent
look,
with me.
and the other problem is that we tend to have this real misconception, back to emotional resilience, a real misconception about what emotional strength is. We think emotional strength is the absence of emotions.
I
You're
know.
strong if you can go through horrific things
You're good.
like this. And like,
Yeah.
that's not strong at all, because real emotional strength is about being able to acknowledge how you actually feel and be okay with those feelings, because they're the natural feelings. There's, when you're grieving, you're sad. If you can't acknowledge that you're really sad, if you can't acknowledge that you feel really rejected and insecure after a breakup, which everyone does, literally everyone does, not everyone admits it, not everyone expresses it, but everyone does, then that's not strong. That's just deceptive, self-deceptive mostly, right? Strength is, like if you took two people, right, and gave them each a very difficult, this happened to me once with two entrepreneurs in New York City, just in the same week with patients, sometimes like similar stories. So these two women were entrepreneurs, and both of them went for rounds of funding and failed. And one of them was so upset she burst into tears in front of her team, and she was just devastated and had to tell them it's not working. And the other one did the stoic thing, and she thanked everyone, and she didn't show any emotion, and she went home. Now, if you took a snapshot and you would say who's stronger emotionally, you'd be like, well, the second one. But what happened is the first person got home, cried for 2 days, got up and started a new venture. And the other one, who didn't, never started a new venture. The bounce back is what matters here. And sometimes you can seemingly be stoic, but you're not bouncing back. And the other thing is, if you take any of the action heroes that we see in movies, right, and put them in an emotional fight with their girlfriend or boyfriend, they will crumble. You will not see them being that heroic, because that's a sphere they're not that comfortable with, and so they'll just get flooded, and they won't know what to do, and they'll get panicked, and suddenly they look very different, because resilience isn't even general, it's case specific. We can be resilient about some things we feel good about, and we can be very non-resilient about other things. And so we keep thinking that strong people are strong. No. All people are people. All people have their weaknesses. All people have their strengths. You can develop them, and you should. You developed those skills, those connective skills, and you developed your community, and you developed your social network. Amazing. But you had to work really hard at it. It doesn't come easy.
Oh yeah, and I had to know that's what it was, awareness of being like, wow, I let this fall through. I did. And that's on me to now. And it doesn't happen overnight, it happens over many months sometimes
Yes.
a few years, but
Yes.
it does happen.
Yes.
And I want to be aware of your time, but I did want to ask you, you have this awesome podcast where you just talk about all these amazing situations.
So,
Why?
so here's what's unique about the podcast. It's called Dear Therapists, with an S at the end. And it's myself and a woman called Lori Gottlieb. We're both therapists. We're both also advice columnists. And each week we do this. We get letters from listeners, obviously. We choose a letter, and we start by reading the letter to one another. And we don't discuss the case before we get there. So we start taping. One of us reads the letter to the other person, and then we do like a case consultation, like clinicians do. We'll have just a few minutes of well, in this kind of situation, you would expect this, or these are my questions, or some observations. Then we bring the person in for a live session, and we do a full-on session with them. A lot of the time, the letter they wrote is about problem X, but the session goes to Y, because that's what happens in therapy a lot of the time. You think this is your issue, but actually this is your issue. And then at the end of that session, which you hear live, so you literally hear a therapy session, at the end of the session, we give that person actionable advice in multiple parts that they have to do within a week.
Within a week, that's probably
within a week,
necessary.
related to the issue, obviously.
Yeah.
And then they have to report back on how that went. And then we have a wrap-up discussing what it all means.
Yeah, I think it seems like all of this, and not all of it, there's so many different things, but finding the tools, using the tools to create connection and connectivity seems like to be the baseline of what resolves loneliness, which could come from a result of a breakup or a loss of a pet or a loss of a loved one. We've lost a deep, deep connection, and we need to find the skills to connect with ourselves again. Guy, I really appreciate your time. This was awesome.